We're live, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. Another critical conversation with the Research Rebels. I'm Leonard, also known as Teaching on the Move. We're here with Shaka, with Tika, and most importantly, we are here with Dr. Jane Landers from Vanderbilt University. Just to introduce Dr. Landers to us, she is a leading historian of the African diaspora in the Atlantic world, specializing in history of Africans and their descendants and colonial Latin America. She is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor of History at Vanderbilt University and the founder and director of Slave Society's Digital Archive, which preserves millions of endangered documents from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Her award-winning books, including Black Society in Spanish Florida and Atlantic Creoles in the Age of Revolutions, have shaped the field of Atlantic history. Through her groundbreaking archival work and digital scholarship, Dr. Landers has brought to light the vital role of African and Afro-descendant peoples in shaping the Americas. So again, we appreciate having you here. Just a little bit about us. We are the Research Rebels. We are keen on making sure that African history is preserved, especially African descendant history is preserved. And so we are in the business of fact-checking individuals who do not respect that history, and who seek to erase it. And of course, in this world where education is constantly under attack and history is constantly under attack as well, we want to be on the front lines of dismantling misinformation when we see it. And so your sources came up as some of the ones that were oftentimes used to not so much combat misinformation, but to be used as a way or as a tool to encourage misinformation. And so we want to make sure that we set the record straight, starting with you, and allowing for you to share your insight on the expertise that you have with the transatlantic slave trade, and most specifically with South America and Central America, with the Latin American movement with African descendants. And so I'm going to start with Tika. I'm going to pass it off to you, Tika, if you don't mind. You can start beginning hitting us off with the questions.
Yes, most definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Landers, for being with us today. We truly appreciate you, participating and being a part of what we are trying to accomplish, which is just to maintain our history and to ensure that it is not sullied with misinformation. So once again, I do want to thank you for just being a part of this particular discussion today. Our first question deals with hold on a second. All right. Sorry. Okay. So what we want to do, Dr. Landers, is ask you primarily about your work. Your work has helped to uncover a world of African agency and resistance in colonial Latin America. What first drew you to this field, especially at a time when this area was vastly under-researched?
Oh, thanks, Tika, for your question, and all of you for having me here. Well, I think I got into this field basically because I grew up in the Dominican Republic, and it was, the first place Columbus landed, the place for the first major slave rebellion, the first free Black Republic, all of those things. And, at the University of Florida, where I went to graduate school, they have a wonderful Caribbean collection. And I started finding documents for just graduate classes about runaway slaves from Carolinas coming into Spanish Florida. And I wondered why. And I was also interested and influenced by the wonderful work of Peter Wood, who wrote Black Majority, which just came out on its 50th anniversary again. And so that led me to finding out about individual people who were running into St. Augustine, Florida. And I found out why eventually, as I backed it up into the 1680s. They were coming because Spain had a totally different religious and legal system available to people of African descent. They had slavery, but they also had many, many free people of African descent in all their colonies. And so that accidental discovery of the runaways from Carolina ended up moving me from a plan to work on Brazilian history to working on what is the southern tier of our country, from Florida to California, as well as the rest of Latin America and Brazil.
Dr. Landers, thank you for that. How does your research connect to the histories of Africa, Latin America, and the U.S. South in ways that are oftentimes overlooked? Because I know that when we talk about history, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade especially, we oftentimes dissect these different areas separately. But in actuality, we see that there's a continuum, right? With all of these people connected in some way. So how does your research hit on those places that are oftentimes overlooked or get a little bit more emphasis than the other places that should?
Well, I sometimes, when I'm speaking to public audiences, especially, I refer to the 1619 project, which was a very big success, but it reinforced the idea that African history in our country begins in 1619 in Virginia. And here I had been doing all this work, back into the 16th century on Africans across the southern tier. And I just have to say that most of it, I think the difference is because of the language barriers, that most people work in English language documents. And you have to have Spanish basically to do the research on those old records in the Spanish South. And so that was one of the reasons I think it's been overlooked and underappreciated. But, a friend of mine who's an archaeologist and was in grad school with me at Florida became the head of the archaeology department in the National Park Service. And he worked with people who did a great exhibit in California showing that the founders of Los Angeles were Afro-Mexicans. And so it was basically the same formula that I find with free Africans on all of the frontiers, establishing the places, holding it, becoming militia people, having their own churches. And those church records that I have worked in for all these many, many years are considered sacraments by the Catholic Church. So they're not thrown out. They're not, destroyed if possible. They save them from fires and hurricanes. And when you asked about the differences, I think you were referring maybe to the African experience. There are very great differences actually in depending on where you came from on the African continent, because everything begins sort of in Senegal and the Canary Islands and Cape Verde and so on and so forth, and we move on down to the south and we get to the Congo Angolese places where there'd been a Catholic church there since the 15th century. So we have people converting and exposed to Islam in the north, and people converting and exposed to Catholicism in the south. So there's a lot of difference. But the similarities are that the Anglos, the English people, thought of everybody African as a piece of property, not as a human being, as someone who could be sold away from family, as someone who could actually be murdered without much, any punishment in some cases. Whereas even if you were an enslaved woman, somebody that I call the doubly dispossessed in the Spanish world, you could report crimes, you could go to court, you could ask for, help from the government, you could ask for a new owner if you remained enslaved, and you could buy your way out of slavery in a legal system called coartación, where if you negotiated it through the courts about the value the owner would lose, you pay them off bit by bit, and then you enter the free community. And so that could make you a free person. Serving in the militia could make you free. Your owner could free you at the baptismal font or at the last will and testament, wherever. So there were a lot of, I say it's a fluid system of slavery. There are ways to get in it and there are ways to get out. Whereas the chattel slavery principle of the English system is everybody's a piece of property, and property rights trump all. No
Right.
pun intended.
Yeah. Thank you so much for answering that, Dr. Landers. Through your work with Spanish colonial sources, you've uncovered remarkable contributions of African descended explorers, military leaders, and interpreters, such as Juan Gerrito, who comes up a lot when we are having these discussions online. We just wanted to go ahead and ask you, in regards to that, who was Juan Gerrito?
And I did send you an image of him, Tika, so if you all want to show that right now, and then
Okay.
Yes,
I'm
for
sorry
sure.
to interrupt you.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think Khalil, if you could bring up the image of Juan Gerrito,
Okay, well,
that would be great.
probably you've had a lot of information about him, probably, but he is coming from North Africa through Portugal into Spain, and the whole southern tier of Spain and Portugal is also African, if you will.
Mhm.
You can see many art images and so on of how a multiracial, multilingual, multi-everything, the south of those two parts of the Iberian Peninsula. And as the explorers are coming over after Columbus, people who wanted to, you know, rise or take a chance and get, you know, some kind of fabulous wealth or whatever it might have been, joined those expeditions. And he was one of those. And so he's moved already from North Africa to Portugal to Spain. Then he comes into Española. He's involved in the wars of conquest there, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba. And in Cuba, he signs up with Hernando Cortez.
Mhm.
And, you know, he'll end up all the way over in Mexico and California. But he had come earlier into Florida in 1513. So he's the first African person we know that there he is who comes into
Mhm.
Florida. But his big adventure was with Cortez, of course, off to the conquest of Mexico. And so even the indigenous artists were, you know, taken by him, and they paint him right next to Cortez in these images, along with Doña Marina, the woman that helps guide Cortez. She's up at the front. A lot of indigenous laborers in the back that they actually brought with them from Cuba to do the heavy labor.
Mhm.
And he makes it all the way through to the conquest of Mexico. And he is a literate man, so he writes to the King of Spain. And in that system that I talked about earlier, which is so different, the king, if he's a good monarch, he's supposed to be, owes all of the people who serve him some sort of reciprocal obligations for their service to him. And so that's why people write these things called méritos y servicios, my merits and services. And he leaves this account of everything he did, all the expeditions he was on, and he asks for a job. And he eventually, you know, we see him, he ends up married and with children, and he's leaving a written record like all the other people of African descent in civil records, military records, religious records. He's not a piece of property.
Mm. Okay. Just to clarify, Juan Garrido is often, in research, he's West African in descent. Can you speak to, these West African descendants that were brought into the Iberian Peninsula, known as Ladinos?
Yes, Ladinos, meaning people who could speak Spanish and had lived in a civil society with the Spaniards and so on. So the young scholars who are doing most of that work, the main providers were from Senegal, and I've taken my teams to Senegal too, looking for people. And traders came down from Portugal and Spain and established contacts with the African kings on the coast for trade. And there had earlier been trade across the Sahara through North Africa. And once Portugal gets the right to investigate Africa, because Columbus got the New World supposedly,
Mhm.
Portugal is the first in the door of big contacts in West Africa. But Spain's in there too, English people too, even though, that's not approved by a crown. They're there trading. And what happens is most of the people that are brought out of Senegal to Cape Verde Islands, the archipelago there, are those that get traded into the Caribbean. And so you do see, as the Europeans advance down the coast, a movement in the types of ethnic groups that get brought in to the Americas. And another famous one that people always write about is Esteban, the Moor, as they call him. And I've researched him as well for the National Park Service. And his town was Azamor. And they now have a neat tile mural of him up in their city to honor him. So he's honored now both in our narratives and in theirs. And what I found out about him was that, he was a free man, and in Morocco, Azamor's on the coast, but there was an epidemic and a famine, a very hard one, and everybody was dying in North Africa, and they would go to the docks and willingly sell themselves into slavery if somebody would take them out. And that's how he ends up with Esteban Dorantes, who he was in the expedition with. But again, it was a way in which you might temporarily sell yourself into slavery, but with the hopes of being rewarded for your later service, which he was.
Yeah.
And it's better than dying of starvation in Morocco.
Right.
Hey, Dr. Landers, Tika, you mind if I jump in for 1 second?
Sure, no problem.
Yes, Dr. Landers, just touching on the subject of Esteban the Moor, was it known that he was a converso, or did he practice Islam?
No, there's nothing that tells us that. There is nothing that tells us that, and when you find out he comes from the town of Azamor, that might have been where they picked that up. If he had been, which is not impossible, of course, when he's coming from Morocco, he would have been probably, required to convert to Catholicism. And, as you all know, when the Muslims of North Africa sweep into Spain and Portugal, 711, it's an 800-year war over territory there. The Christians push southward, and it's finally in 1492 that they regain their territory. But it doesn't mean the Muslim wars are over, because they run to the mountains of Granada there and fight again. Although many went back to North Africa, and some probably happily so. But there's nothing that really, is any proof that he was had been a convert to Islam. Even in Morocco, there were so many different religious practices and languages and so on that not everybody was at that point.
I just have one more question.
Sure.
And just to go back just a little bit, you mentioned during the time of Hector Cortez, when he lands in Mexico, were there indigenous or native people who were with him that was part of his party?
I didn't hear you too well, Khalil. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, what I was asking was, when Herman Cortez lands on and goes with his party into Mexico, into the Aztecs, were there indigenous or native people with him who assist him in the invasion?
There were some who had come from Cuba that they had brought with them from Cuba. You saw the people in the back carrying the loads in that image. Okay. But also they will end up having indigenous allies from the coast, because the way the Aztec Empire was working at the time he arrives, the Aztecs had expanded their territory through force, through military force, and required people that they conquered to give them tribute and so on all the way every year. And sometimes the tribute was human life. So not everybody was happy living under Aztec rule. And here comes a different person and a different group, and they say, hey, here's our opportunity to, you know, get rid of the Aztec control that they saw as they saw it. And so some indigenous groups fought with the Spaniards to free themselves from the yoke of the Aztecs.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Just to go over that particular aspect again, because we always hear a lot of these different things. So we just spoke about Juan Gerrito, where he possibly, his background as far as being, you said, from possibly Senegal in West Africa. I wanted to also talk about the African participation in the conquest of the Americas. As far as we talk about Juan Gerrito, he's just one example. Are there other, conquistadors of African descent as well that you want to highlight?
There are. A wonderful scholar of the Yucatan, Matthew Restall, wrote an article about Black conquistadors. And more recently, I worked with the Association of African American Life and History and the National Park Service on a grant to track the earliest Africans that we could find in those expeditions. And my wonderful ex-graduate student, David Wheat, who has a wonderful book I recommend to you all called Atlantic Africa, is the best person on the early languages in the script of 16th century Spanish and Portuguese. And he's been tracking all of this for years with me. We've gone to Africa many times together. And also I roped him into this grant, and he went through all the little notarial archives in Spain looking into this, and I followed him in that summer, and we turned in the report to the National Park Service. However, as you all indicated at the beginning, it's a hard time for Black history, and whether or not
that part,
whether or not all that research we dug up will ever come to be, I don't know. But we wanted to do it, and I'm glad we did it. And there's another wonderful indigenous image of Juan Gerrito, and you see him dressed all beautifully like a Spaniard, and Cortez ahead of him, and then Doña Marina in the foreground. But these Park Service interpreters then could do a whole different take on this in the places, and we were following. The grant was specifically for those who went with De Soto, Hernando de Soto, in 1539. And so we found that many people who had been enslaved, if their owner in Iberia, if their owner wanted to be part of this expedition, they would often say, I'll manumit you if you come along. So some people that way. Others were already free and came because they wanted to make it big, like Gerrito. And we even found one African American woman, believe this or not, that came on this expedition from 1539. For 4 years, she treks across the South with indigenous battles and, all sorts of hardships, wading through water up to her chest and so on. De Soto dies after he's crossed the Mississippi River, and they've already fought at Arkansas. They come back and he dies, and they float him down the river so nobody knows he's dead. And the people make little boats and come down, and she's one of the survivors that gets all the way down to Mississippi to go to the Viceroy of New Spain, or Mexico, as we would say, and report all of this. And then she gets back somehow all the way to Spain, and supports her owner and tells his services and merits. So I couldn't believe that we found one woman too.
Okay. Do we have her name by chance, or is she's just a footnote in history? Or
she has a name, and I'm sorry I didn't look it up right before the message, but
no, that's okay.
Before our Zoom, but We do have her name, and we gave it, and she has her owner's name because she was enslaved, but was a servant with them all along. But believe it or not, she saw all those battles through Florida and Texas, and
Wow.
and survived.
Yeah. So I wanted to just go ahead and just to clarify once again, because I think Khalil touched on this, but just want to make sure that, we know that on behalf of colonization, Juan Gerrito's actions in regards to the indigenous population has often been scrutinized. But we just wanted to go ahead and, talk about the fact that what about the role of indigenous allies in conquest as well? Just to clarify, the fact that those particular individuals were also a part of the conquest of several different groups like the Aztecs and so on.
That's right. Indigenous allies to the Spaniards, if they saw they wanted to get out from under the Aztecs, they joined the Spaniards. And the same thing goes on our continent. These are, as I say, geopolitically literate people. They learn there's a difference between the English and the Spanish, and which one is going to give me the best deal or treat me the worst, and I'll go with them. And they're savvy about it, and they figure it out. So, alliances shift, but they choose their best option out of those. And so, indigenous people did the same thing. When those English people come in, they have no, Christian obligation, as Spaniards would see it, to bring them into the fold, to get them converted, to treat them. Queen Isabella thought of them as sort of virgin populations that hadn't been exposed to Islam, and so she wants them to become Catholics. And she tells the Spaniards, you're not allowed to enslave them, even though they do. But so indigenous people and Africans had choices once these Europeans start competing, and they make their best choices. And so we end up seeing the same things, the opportunities for indigenous leaders to become militiamen, to own property, to get roles in their communities. And basically the Spaniards there weren't enough Spaniards to control this huge amount of territory, if you think about from the Philippines to Chile to Florida. So they have to create alliances and depend on people and make them part of the community. And they always had indigenous militias as well as African militias with them. And so, yeah, it's a multicultural place.
Okay.
Go
Go ahead, each one. Go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. I just wanted to say this. It sounded very familiar to what was going on again during the time period of colonization in Africa, right? When we talk about native groups fighting against individuals or other indigenous populations that were much stronger, right? So Eritrea is what I'm thinking about, fighting against Ethiopia, but using the side of the Italians to do so. So it seems like it's all, again, a strategic situation of geopolitics that must be acknowledged. So I'm glad that you said that.
Okay. The next question is from Shaka. And it's basically just asking about, what primary documentation do we have in regards to Juan Gerrito going into Florida in 1513? Like, where would be able to locate those kind of documentations?
Well, you'd have to be able to read Spanish paleography of the 16th century, but we've already transcribed it. And, so we include it in a lot of things. And he tells it. He says, and I did this and I did that. And I went here.
One more time. Sorry for my loud background, but one more time. I specifically asked that question just so that you can say it. I'm sorry. I got so excited the way you answered it. You answered exactly how I anticipated. Can you say it one more time? What languages you have to read it in again?
He is, I'm sorry. Paleography is the handwritten script. And so it varies over time. When I first started going to Spain, I had to take classes in the University of Seville, and they start with how you draw stuff on clay. That's how far back they go. And then there's Arabic texts, and there's Castilian Spanish texts, and so on. And it moves through time. And also then you have to learn the abbreviations and all of that sort of thing. But, when you get closer, like to the 16th century and 17th century, I can get it. And we have transcribed it all. And, he tells about everywhere he went, but he also says things like, and then I buried the dead in Mexico City. That was a good Christian thing to do, when after the devastation. And he said, and I planted the first wheat in New Spain. And that was also something that it doesn't sound important to us, but it was to the Spaniards, because they didn't like eating maize and corn and so on. And they wanted to eat what they were used to, which was wheat, And so he writes about all those sorts of things, and he established a chapel, and this is all in there, as well as, and I went here and I went there.
Okay. Well, so he basically spoke for himself.
Yes, of course. And that was the way it went. And that's why I meant even women could write, even if they were enslaved. And if they didn't know how to write, and this was a lot of people didn't know how to write, they got translators for them. So in that Black Society book, I talk about some recently introduced enslaved Africans in Florida who didn't know any Spanish yet, but they had people there who knew their language, who told them what to do when their owner abused them, and they went to court and reported it. There's a translator that you can find in your own language. If you can't write, you sign with an X, and then there'll be two people that'll be your witnesses that sign, and they usually say, for so-and-so who doesn't know how to write. And then the court system was supposed to read it all back to you and allow you to make any corrections or changes in your testimony. And even children of the age of reason, they said, which is about 12 usually, are allowed to testify in court.
Okay, thank you so much. So the next question again is from Shaka. This one is about the Portuguese. Basically, he's asking, are you familiar with the Portuguese and plantation system? If so, can you give some detail as to how it got started and what prompted them to begin a plantation and enslavement of African people?
Okay, well, Portugal is a little sliver of a country down the west coast of what we call the Iberian Peninsula. A very small place, small population, and so on. But when Columbus claimed the whole New World, Portugal had that long Atlantic coast. They'd been used to being seamen already in the Mediterranean and making contacts and so on. And they say, hey, wait, God didn't give the whole New World to Spain. And the King of Spain, the King of Portugal, work out a treaty with the Pope, who controls all of the, Catholic world. And it says, okay, Spain will get the New World, Portugal will get Africa. And they did. They coasted all the way down, just the coast, trading and so on. They never controlled territory. But on one of the expeditions, they're really wanting to go to China, to the Orient, which is where they thought all the wealth was after Marco Polo told all his fabulous tales. And that's where they're headed. They're going to go through India and so on. Well, eventually, supposedly, one of the ships of the Portuguese on their way back to Portugal is blown off course, supposedly, and lands on the Brazilian coast just long enough to claim it and to plant a flag and say a prayer and write some testimony about what they saw. And Portugal then can claim Brazil, and they have to go through another treaty to divvy up South America. And they have no idea really how large it is or how far this line is supposed to go, this treaty line. But they get Portugal, and they get Brazil, excuse me, Shaka. Mm-hmm. They don't do much with it because they're poorer and smaller than Spain. But when the French start trying to come in there, that's when Portugal will devote some resources and start to actually send settlers and try to make a plantation system start there. And the money maker was sugar. And so sugar is made with blood, is the old Cuban saying. It's a bad, harsh, horrible system. And that's what made Brazil wealthy eventually was sugar, until they find gold and diamonds in the south, and then the whole economy shifts southward.
Thank you. So this goes along with the question Shaka asked you, and this is from him once again. Is that is there a documented history of the total earnings of Portuguese plantation holders in the area at the start of the plantation system?
No, that kind of quantification is hard to find anywhere, even in the modern world. You know how people
Mhm.
shift on corporate earnings and all that kind of thing. But they had really started sugar in other places before it gets to Brazil. And but it does become a big moneymaker in Brazil, and people did make wealth on it. They really make even more when they find gold and diamonds down in the southern part called Minas Gerais, the general mines. And
Mm.
but sugar picks up again after the Haitian Revolution, when the French plantations are all burned to dust. Then
Mhm.
again, people want to rev it up again in Brazil and in Cuba.
Yeah. Okay. This is another question from Shaka, of course. It says, "What is the best resource or site to find history of the Portuguese enslavement of African people?"
Oh, there's so many wonderful books and authors on it. You have to, and here again, you have to learn Portuguese to do it.
Mhm.
But there are amazing, wonderful works on Portuguese traders in Africa. And in Brazil, there's also many wonderful ones, and a lot of material is online. Um, now through the National Archives and so on. And one of the things we put up on our Slave Society's digital archive, you may have read about the big fire that happened in the Brazilian National Museum, like their Smithsonian, burned up everything,
Mhm.
which included a big, huge African exhibit. And
Mhm.
one of my colleagues who works with us in Brazil and Africa had done a big catalog to teach African history to Brazilian kids. It's part of the Constitution. And
Mhm.
she had it in Portuguese. Once that burned up, we paid to get a Library of Congress, or we got a Library of Congress number for it and had it all translated into English. And it's up there with all the African objects and the history that she presented for school children to learn in Brazil.
Mhm.
It's called Kumbu Kumbu, and it's online on Slave Society's digital archive in the Brazilian section.
Okay.
So we have our main places that we went and preserved documents were the most African places, right? So
Mhm.
I started a long time ago in Florida, but the most African places are Brazil and Cuba, and then we've added Colombia a lot. We have small bits from Angola and Benin, and I'm trying to think. Mexico we've added, and so on. So Africans in those places, we have their documents from their baptismal stuff to their property records, as many as we can save.
Oh wow. Yeah, thank you so much. I often reference one of the articles is called Old Moldy Church Records Reveal. And it was from the first site that you had before it turned into the Slave Society's one.
Oh, thanks.
Um yeah. So going right into that, this question is from another member of our research team, Emma. And Emma's asking, where can we find the Catholic Church's records of West Africans that were maybe baptized in Spain before and after the 13th century? Is this information available online?
No, it is not. I would love to get to do that sometime, but Spain's records are not as endangered as, say, you know, Española, where we have hurricanes and floods and poverty and so on.
Mhm.
I'm sure that there are some that are maintained from that time period. I have an image up on our site of a 13th century baptism of an African man in a great big marble font with a
Mhm.
Spanish priest and Spanish owners right next to him. And the formula was they would usually be the godparents for him to bring him into the church. And so this is, shows us that there, and this was from the King of Spain, Alfonso el Sabio, the Wise, in his beautiful, colorful work of art that he did. There is this painting. So I know that they have them somewhere. I just haven't taken my teams there because there's so many places where they're more endangered, the records. But it's the same formula. And that's what makes it sort of easy to track things, because every entry is going to tell you the name of the person. If they can, they'll tell you the ethnic group of the person. They'll tell you the priest. They'll tell you if they are free or enslaved. Sometimes they even say their profession. They'll tell you if it is an enslaved person who their owners were. Always will have their godparents. That's in the baptismal records. And then the name of the priest and the parish. And each one would be the same all the way through to the ones I'm looking at into the 19th century. The same requirements of the Catholic Church to put that information in there. Tika, I'm not hearing you.
Tika, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is a question that I, wanted to ask in regards to when we're looking at, you just spoke about so eloquently about how the Catholic Church and certain colonizers like the French, like the Spanish, because of the fact that they were Catholic, were able to record a lot of information about people of African descent. And you just spoke about the details into which they did. Now, my question is, when comparing English Protestant and Iberian Catholic forms of slavery, how are the differing religious frameworks? How does that shape the treatment of people of African descent within each system? And
okay. No, go ahead, Tika. I'm sorry. Did you?
No, I'm sorry. And I'm sorry. I tend to be long-winded. So, and in what ways did these religious worldviews influence the legal, social, and spiritual conditions of enslavement? How did these conditions or distinctions affect the pathways to manumission or freedom? In regards to people of African descent, just touch on how each colonizer was different in that way.
Well, you hit on all the big questions there, Tika, because as I said earlier a little bit, Spain had come off of an 800-year war against Islam and was in a religious fervor, if you will. And so I always write that Queen Isabella basically saw their recovery of Christian land as a sign from God that they were on the right path. And Christopher Columbus writes back to her once he does get to the New World and says all kinds of things that make it sound like it's part of a biblical, or providential thing that God wanted them to have this. And she says, yes, as long as you baptize everybody and so on. So from the beginning, we see missionaries trying to learn indigenous languages, trying to learn African languages as well. And we have some confessionaries and catechisms and so on from Angola, for instance, that were published in Lisbon. So both the Catholic Portuguese and the Catholic Spaniards were trying to do this, and they were keeping records all the time. Once Martin Luther King breaks with the Catholic Church and Protestantism rises, it's a religious war as well as a territorial war all over the world. And so the English become Protestants, the French, some of them become Protestants and call themselves Huguenots. And it was those Protestant French that tried to get Brazil. And so, how much of it was a heartfelt religious thing and how much of it was for profit and territory is hard to say. But by that Catholic belief, these were human beings, even if enslaved. They actually felt slavery was against the laws of nature and man, they said. It was an unnatural condition. So you get into it for crime or poverty or something else, or being sold by an African on the African coast into slavery. You're sold. You're a slave, so they don't feel bad buying you. You're already an enslaved person. That's how the Catholics felt about it. But they had a responsibility to convert you and to follow the civil law of the Catholic world. Was also a law that went back to the Roman system, all the way back to Roman law called the Justinian Code. And again, it tells you how you can get out of slavery by these various means. So the Spaniards and the Portuguese had Roman law and Catholic law that both leaned towards freedom and good treatment and conversion. That doesn't mean it always is true. I always tell my classes, law doesn't always equal practice, but it is the thing, and the church could condemn you for mistreatment of a slave. Also, so could the civil law. On the other hand, Protestants, thinking this is property, felt they had the right to do whatever with them. And in fact, they didn't want people to learn how to read and write, to learn about rights or whatever, and possibly learn about what I call religious sanctuary in the Spanish half of the country. And so, it's not until you get to sort of the 1840s when you start to see AME churches and so on start to grow, and Protestant preachers finally reaching out to enslaved people. Then you start to see some effort, but it's nothing like centuries and centuries worth of codified law and religious training as well.
Okay.
I have one question along those lines. So this is Khalil, Miss Landis. How are you?
Hi, Khalil.
Yes. So would you say along those same lines that you're speaking about, did the English at around what time period would you say chronologically did slavery get exclusively tied to the Negro or to Black people or Africans at that particular time? Because, like you said, in the old world, slavery was somewhat of a status in some aspects, and it wasn't necessarily tied to a specific people or a specific race.
Mm-hmm.
So within the new world, when would you say that it got tied specifically to the Negro?
Well, I don't know if you could point out well, you could. You could actually go through the law codes and look at that. And there was a wonderful article by Ira Berlin way back when in the William and Mary Quarterly that looked at the 13 colonies and gave you exactly the years and talked about each law that finally set slavery in place hard and fast, associating it with people of African descent. It hadn't been in the beginning, and some of the earlier people that were in the colonies were actually free people of African descent. There were a few. Then there were a lot of indentured Irish to do the heavy, hard work for a long time, too. And I find Irish and Africans running together to St. Augustine because the Irish were Catholics, too. So it takes a while for the English to codify it all. And each colony is a little bit different. But that Ira Berlin article had that down for you. And it's an older article, but it's a good one for teaching or for, checking out each colony. And if somebody was in New York, they're not working in plantations, they're working in little farms, or they're working in the city and so on. It's a different system, and they weren't as fearful or as fanatic about pinning people in a racial condition as you are when you get to, say, South Carolina, and you're starting to plant indigo and rice and other things with a lot of hard labor required. And the population numbers are what makes everybody see it differently. If you're a few Africans in an urban New York setting, that's one thing. If you are the dominant population in South Carolina and there's only a few, pink people around, then that's a scary proposition for those planters, and they'll try to be harsh and they'll try to make the law strict and so on and so forth.
Yeah, because I think the same thing would apply to the Caribbean and the islands, because the one thing that I always noticed is that there were two specific systems. You had the gang system, and then you had the task system. So I would imagine that if you're in the Caribbeans and you have a bunch of Africans that are working in sugar, that you would be a little bit more harsher to try to keep them oppressed. I have one last question pertaining to that. Specifically, the Portuguese at one point in time early on, they used the term Negro de Terra, and then they also used the term Negro de Guinea. Some people try to say, like, that they didn't know the difference. Could you explain why they used that term Negro de Guinea and then Negro de Terra?
They're both basically, well, you could say da terra, you could say would be the same if you said in English Creole, somebody born on this side of the water, whereas de Guinea means born on that side of the water. And Guinea was just a generic term that they use on those old maps and everything for all of West Africa. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's the same. Basically, you could say it's kind of like what Tika brought up. Ladino would be da terra. In Portuguese, that means of the land, born on this side.
But my point is they weren't confused about the difference of the two.
No, they knew who was who pretty much. One of the neat things, since you're interested in the Portuguese thing, our records for Brazil, as you'll see if you can look on that Slave Society site. One of the ways people keep their ethnic heritage alive is through the Catholic Church. They were allowed to establish religious brotherhoods, and they would often make them sort of focused on a nation. So you would have the Brotherhood of the Minas or the Brotherhood of the Congos, or, and they would be allowed to have their own, devotions. They would pick a saint to whom they wanted to be devoted, and they would march out with their processions on those days, and they would, devote themselves to good works in the community. Cuba, the same thing. All over, there were these interesting Black brotherhoods that I've also written about.
Right. And I one more question, Tika, and I'm gonna let you go. Can you speak to, as far as the fraternities and sororities, and kind of touch on the fact that those things existed prior to the Portuguese coming over, that in Lisbon, in Seville, these institutions were already established?
That's right. There were. I have some that I found from the 13th century in Spain. And again, you ask the Pope for permission to start this fraternity, and you say, and these are going to be our members, these are going to be our dues, this is going to be the devotion we'll practice, these are the good works we'll do. And then if the Pope approves it, you've got a new Black fraternity, and there are sisters in it too. They're not separate, but they are listed in the membership rolls, and sometimes they will donate property to their own brotherhood if they've gotten wealth of some sort, but they might also devote themselves to hospitals or charities of different sorts. So there were these practices early on in both Spain and Portugal, and they bring them to the New World as well. So Hispaniola is the first colony, and they have them too.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and quickly touch on some. We had a lot of questions for you, but I'm gonna touch on something in regards to Maroons, in regards to the different Maroon communities that are in Latin America, and who did these communities consist of? And that was Emma's questions. And in which countries?
Well, pretty well. Anywhere you've got a swamp or some woods or some mountains, you can run. And so they're all over Latin America. I've written quite a bit about Maroons. That's sort of my thing, because the first free Black town in what is today the United States is those runaways that I talked about from South Carolina into Florida. And they make a free Black town outside St. Augustine, Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, and we now have a big park there and museums and stuff. But they had to get through Georgia, and they had to get through those Savannah swamps too. So there are Maroons in Savannah, there are Maroons in Carolina, in all these other places, and all over Latin America as well. So Hispaniola, it's centuries. I'm finishing up a book now called 3 Centuries of Black Resistance, and it's starts, with the first slave revolt, 1521, goes all the way up to the Haitian slave revolt. And Maroons are 2 centuries of that. They're everywhere in the middle of Hispaniola. And Brazil is the most famous for Palmares, the great big huge one, had 10 villages associated with it. Ganga Zumba ran it, then his nephew Zumbi, who's a national hero, a national holiday. But they're everywhere. They're in Venezuela. They're everywhere.
Thank you. And of course, in regards to Maroons, those are people who are African descent who run off of plantations, run away from slavery. Sometimes they work in conjunction with the indigenous that were there, who are people of Amerindian descent.
Right. Yes, they do.
All right, just wanted to clarify that. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna try and fast track because we're running out of time. Oops, sorry, we're running out of time in regards to the interview, and we really just want to try and get to the most pertinent questions. And so one of them is asked by Emma once again, and I'll just skip to her question. She asks about which Black communities in Latin America still retain their native African languages. She says she recalls one community was contacted by its tribe in Africa via a linguist who studied its dialect. Do you know which community this was and who was the linguist, if possible? And did they make contact and return to their home? Is what she is asking.
Well, in Colombia, outside Cartagena, there's a community that's very famous now and that a linguist has studied. I'm not sure if that's the one she's speaking about, but it's called San Basilio. And they say San Basilio de Palenque. Palenque is the word for runaway community. So that may be the one, San Basilio de Palenque. When I first visited it a long time ago, it was very poor and off the beaten path. And now it's become a major tourist attraction for African American tourists. And so it's lively now. It's all painted up and people are all dressed up and it's become very popular. And Arnold Schwengler, it's hard to say, was the linguist who studied that one. But also in South Carolina, a wonderful anthropologist from Sierra Leone, Joseph Opala, began working with some of the Gullah Geechee folks, as I have also, and they had retained some of their language and didn't know what it was, but he recognized some of it from Sierra Leone, and there's a little film you can look up on YouTube called The Language You Cry In, and it was when the folks from the Gullah Geechee coast were taken back to Sierra Leone, the people recognized the song that they didn't even know what they were singing.
Once again, it's just showing, the continuity of African descended people throughout the diaspora, that there's still those linguistic ties. There's still those, things that maybe we have forgotten, but, through time, we are interconnected with that. I just wanted to go ahead and ask another question in conjunction with that, which is, can you just elaborate on some of the other things like cultural, military or religious continuities that Africans have maintained in the Americas, particularly in Spanish colonies like Hispaniola and Florida? And in what ways have African communities helped to shape the region's development and influence the political and religious institutions of all these early colonial societies?
Wow, that's a big one, Tika. That's a lot. That's several centuries too. No, that's fine. Again, some of the things are linguistic retentions. Some of the things are cultural retentions. And so one of the things I'm really interested in, and some of my grads too, is the environment and how you interpret environment religiously and spiritually. And there's a wonderful book by Ross Michael Brown about the Gullah Geechee, South Carolina understandings of springs and waters and dolphins and so on. And when I go and look at burials up and down the Geechee Coast, sometimes I found one with a dolphin skull on the top. And then I think, oh, that's like when I read about a wonderful article in Brazil called The Great Dolphin Skull Strike, when rowers refused to allow a British scientist to put a dolphin skull in their canoe. So all these sorts of things live on. And one of the greatest sources for this is the WPA narratives from the 1930s. And there's a wonderful book called Drums and Shadows that I assigned to my classes, because it was interviews all up and down the Gullah Coast about, and you'll find things about medicine, about haints, about, the environment, about work, about gender, whatever. And they're wonderful old tales that the old folks told. And they retained a lot of that.
Thank you.
Can I interject 1 second? You don't mind?
Mhm.
And so Neil Hurston was the one who recorded them for Florida. So,
Yeah.
Zora.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, Ms. Landis, just to go back a second about the Maroons, during that first, I guess the first colony that you would say, would that be 1526?
No, in Hispaniola, he claims it in 1492. And the first runaways that I can track are 1503 into the mountains. They become Maroons.
Oh, no. I was talking about specifically that first expedition that the Spanish made, that failed colony off the coast of Georgia.
Okay, that is San Miguel de Gualdape,
right,
near Sapelo, and the man who established that was from Hispaniola. He was a judge in Hispaniola and a big landowner, and had enslaved people, and even had enslaved indigenous people that had been raided from the Atlantic coast of South Carolina and Georgia. And so he gets a contract from the Spanish king to make a settlement, just like you might do in Mexico. You get a contract, you say, I promise I'll make it a Christian place, I'll make it a city, we'll make it wealth for you, we'll provide tribute, I'll convert all those Indians. And he got a contract, and it was a big disaster. There is shipwrecked, and there's epidemics, there's starvation, there's abuse of the indigenous, and there's a revolt, a mutiny, and eventually the first Africans that we know that were brought in to settle in a colony were there, and they go off to live among the indigenous people, and we lose track of them.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Is there any documentation as far as what happened to those Africans?
No, my theory is they just blend into the indigenous.
Okay.
But there were no names in that document, in those early documents, because his colony failed almost immediately.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. And all right. So, and by blending in with the indigenous, you mean that they went ahead and joined with the indigenous people that were there?
That's my guess. We have no proof of that, although one of the archaeologists from the University of Florida, when I was still in grad school, told me that they had discovered at least one African burial along the coast. But when I've tried to track that, I haven't been able to find that report.
Okay. I just wanted to, we were trying to get to some questions from TikTok. So I'm gonna go ahead and trying to make sure that we finish up. So I'm gonna ask you just a few more questions, if you will. One of them is here, in regards to the fact that you've been instrumental in creating the Slave Society's digital archive. How do you envision this archive expanding access and transforming future research in the African diaspora studies?
Well, that's my goal. These are endangered records. I've had a lot of wonderful support from different funding agencies and that have allowed me to do this. And the model is I take my grad students and former grads, and we train the local communities how to digitize for themselves. Students get stipends while they're working. We organize the inventories of the place. We digitize everything. We give them copies of everything, and we get permission. I have to work through contracts and everything to get permission to put it up free for everybody else to use. So everybody has access around the world to this who would never have the kinds of resources we get to travel and to buy equipment. I leave the equipment with them so they can continue to preserve their history. And when we can, we have a little conference or a closing event where we invite the parents of the students to come and the community to come to get the idea of how important these records are.
Okay. And just because I'm trying to move as quickly as possible because we want to get to the questions from TikTok. Dr. Landers, and I'm going to combine these two. You've described your mission as one of changing the narrative and saving the history and making it public. In today's climate, where historical narratives are increasingly contested, what challenges do you face in advancing your mission, particularly in preserving and promoting the African presence in the Atlantic and colonial Latin America?
Well, we don't know exactly yet how much they're going to shut us down, but for now, as I mentioned, the National Park Service has given me some recent grants and the National Park Service got a big grant in Florida to a challenge grant, it's called, where you get local businesses and funders and so on to match the money that the state got. And they more than matched it. The Jacksonville Jaguars from Florida gave money. The Wells Fargo Bank gave money. Lots of businesses gave money. There's a great blues festival every February there, and that raises money too for Fort Mose. And with that money, we just put up a replica of one of the first forts there. So there's a museum, there's educational materials we preserved and created so that fourth grade teachers can teach that history. Whether or not that will continue, I don't know, but we provided it, and it's been going all this time. And we have updated the Mose catalog of all the archaeological and imagery that we found. And that'll be published in September, they tell us now, from the University of Florida Press. And it's called Fort Mose, Black Fortress of Freedom.
Okay, thank you. And this is a final question from our group. How would you like for your work to be remembered by future generations of historians, students, and members of the African diaspora? What is the future of colonial Latin America and African diaspora studies in your view? And what role do you hope your scholarship continues to play in shaping that future?
Well, I just hope people carry it on. I have wonderful graduate students, a whole generations of them, and they help me do this preservation work. Then they go off and write their own wonderful research. They're training their own students. So one of our former grad students, David Lefevre at the University of Texas, Arlington, has been the photographer and the training all of our project people all over. He's an expert in Cuba as well. And as I mentioned, David Wheat on Atlantic Africa. My recent grad student, Justin Jones, is from Florida, African-American, brilliant scholar who just finished his exams. I took him to Columbia and he learned some of this work with us too. So generations, I hope, will continue to train new people to keep up the work and push it forward.
Okay, well, Dr. Landers, I thank you so much for being here. Now we're going to switch to questions from the actual audience, on TikTok. So we want to make sure that everybody gets to ask questions that are watching from the chat. So if anyone wants to start with that, I don't know if Shaka wants to do those particular questions, or if anyone else wants to ask that from the chat.
Yeah, Shaka, go for it.
Yeah, I could do it, but real quick before you go, just to give me a little time, switch over to my device one more time. Just let's go over the fact that we cannot depend on just American English sources for the Portuguese and Spaniard, for the records that they have that shows the start of this system of enslavement. Can you go over just one more time the sources you have to get them from and the languages that you have to get them in?
Well, the main languages that we're working in are Spanish and Portuguese, but the whole half of our country was kept in Spanish. And then there's huge Brazil, but you could go to Angola and you could go to other parts of Mozambique and other parts of the Atlantic world and then the Indian world as well to find Portuguese records. Golden Goa from India had Portuguese Catholic churches, same kind of records in all those places. So if you have Portuguese or you have Spanish, you can do a lot of these. And then, you know, now with AI and all the translations that are being made possible, you know, even if you don't have them, one of my former grad students, Dr. Daniel Jenkins, is a computer whiz, and he's been training the computer to translate these into, you know, English for us, or into typed Spanish and Portuguese, and then we'll go to English from the written. And sooner or later, that's all going to be possible. But we used to have the languages to be able to get it, and to let people know that it's not the same system all over the world.
Yeah, Dr. Landis, just a short. I saw that, and I thought it was interesting because the AI, he was training it to actually read the Portuguese cursive, and that's amazing because now you're able to actually read the script rather than the phonics or the translation.
Yeah, the script is hard, and then the abbreviations, you have to learn the whole system and the sort of their formulas for recording and asking things. So computers can get it pretty well, but I think you still have to have some, you know, cultural background and language probably.
Okay. And I got this one more last question. As far as Ponce de Leon, when he goes into Florida, is that 1513?
Juan Gerrito into Florida is 1513.
Okay, so Juan Gerrito was with him when he went into...
With Ponce de Leon, yes.
Okay. Were there any auxiliary Africans with him?
There probably were. There probably were.
But they didn't settle there. That was just a...
No, that was exploratory. And then they go back, and Ponce de Leon tries again and actually gets shot by an indigenous poisoned arrow and dies. So Gerrito finds another sponsor, patron, that he joins up with, and that's going to be Hernando Cortez.
Right, because the reason why I asked that is, again, like you stated in the beginning, as far as the 1619 project, it seems like a whole century before, you know what I'm saying, there's Africans and explorers. And,
yeah. I did a TED Talk where that was the title, The Missing Century of Black History.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And I know that is the goal and that is the mission of your work, Dr. Landers, is to highlight this specific time period where, you know, we go before 1619. We start at the very beginning. We start at the Treaty of Tordesillas. and that's where I really hope that people start beginning the discussion about African presence in the Americas, coming from that particular time point, because like you stated in the beginning, Spain and Portugal, they are the first people or colonizers from Europe in this particular region, due to that treaty and due to that line of demarcation. With that being said, we're going to go now to some questions that, you know, viewers on TikTok are asking. The first question is from Conrad Jenkins. Say if we could ask you about how the Dutch/Portuguese war impacted the Portuguese sugar trade.
Well, when the Dutch come into Brazil, they not only get northeastern Brazil, they also will at the same time take Angola. And so all of a sudden, they've got the whole network. They've got the slave trade that they can introduce into Brazil. And they think they're going to do it up right, that the Portuguese have been sloppy and lazy, you know, the prejudices about people, and that the Dutch are going to make these nice, clean, more efficient plantations and so on and so forth. And so there's a whole wonderful group of paintings, if you ever want to see them, by Frederick Post, P-O-S-T, and he does nice plantation systems. Everything looks peaceful and quiet and so on. And that Dutch period did just happen in the Northeast. And then actually there are Brazilians who end up fighting against them, and also Brazilians of African descent who even go to Angola as well.
Okay. We have another question from the audience. This is from Lucky Charms 64. Are there records for the Portuguese and or Spanish, I guess, in South Carolina?
Well, they're not kept in South Carolina. They're kept in Spanish archives, but there are lots of things about Carolina planters and traders who come into St. Augustine. Some of them are trying to recapture or reclaim their African runaways, and I've written about that in that Black Society book. And so we do have a lot of, you know, the South Carolina people represented in the Spanish archives. And recently I've been working on the founder of Mose, Francisco Menendez, who is from a Mandinga man from the Gambia River, who gets somehow sold into slavery by the English and taken to Charleston. He rises with the Yamasee Indians and fights for years, a year and a half probably, and then they're defeated and he comes into Florida, and he's the one that'll start the town that I write about. So we have a lot of South Carolina records, but they're in the Spanish archives.
Archives, yes. Next question is from CJ. How much did England's partnership with the Ottomans help propel them past the Spanish?
Well, most of that happens in the Mediterranean world, not in the Americas. But there's a lot of piracy that goes on in the Mediterranean world. And again, it's a multilingual, multicultural, as we talked about earlier on in the place in the talk today. So alliances are shifting a lot too. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. It's okay. That's quite.
Yeah. So we have moved out of that time period, the 16th century, pretty much. When we come to the Americas, it's about when all the big settlements will be getting and going, and some of that piracy continues, but I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, okay.
Yeah, I
no
got
problem.
one for you, Nick.
Go ahead.
I got one for you, Tika. Okay. This question is from TikTok from I am Beanie. Were there documented cases of Black women, entrepreneurs, midwives, or healers who carved out space for themselves in colonial cities? Ooh, I know that answer. In Spanish or in Hispaniola. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In all of these areas, there are. I had a whole chapter on Black women in the Black Society book, but they're everywhere. I also did a chapter called Founding Mothers, as a pun, about the women who were very important in starting Fernandina on the Amelia Island and off the coast of Florida. And then I wrote about another one who's a vice queen of a runaway slave community in Colombia called Juana. And so there's a lot of women that we can find taking on roles like that, and entrepreneurs who end up having small businesses or running big plantations even. And one of the most interesting, I think you might like, is by a wonderful friend. Dan Schaefer writes about Anna Kingsley, who is the wife of Zephaniah Kingsley, big, huge Quaker planter from South Carolina who ends up in Florida, and she runs the whole plantation. They move it eventually to Saint Domingue, and it's a wonderful book, and we tracked her all the way to Senegal, to Yang Yang, where her town was.
Okay. So and I also want to thank you once again for your time. I know that your time is we've had you here for a minute going over these questions with you. In regards to, and did anyone have any other questions from TikTok, you guys?
No, but
Yeah, there were a couple more in oh, it wasn't? I thought I saw another one.
Mhm.
Did
So
you
I
see
think
any more teaching?
no, I think
And
we
then
got them.
to add to okay, and to add to it, that the first recorded black woman doctor was Donna Marie Del Carmen. Donna Marie Del Carmen. Just to give you that for the person on TikTok for Benny.
Okay, another question came in just now. They talked about, they're asking about what role did Black children play in maintaining or disrupting cultural memory, um, especially through play, language, or song.
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that anybody's actually studied that, but in terms of education, again, in Spanish Florida, the Catholic Church welcomed in boys only, but in everybody in one classroom that I write about in St. Augustine, you would have the sons of big planters sitting also in the same classroom, getting the same education as the sons of enslaved people in St. Augustine. And, so that was quite a difference too, that, in the English colonies, they didn't want to let people learn to read and write, but in the Catholic world, at least, there were Catholic churches where boys could go. Girls sometimes got educated in their own families' libraries. Some of the planters had great libraries, and sometimes they'd hire tutors. So another one of my former grads, Abraham Liddell, African American scholar now at the Dominican Institute in New York, he tracks 16th century African woman from Cape Verde Island and her brother, and they were educated in Portugal, children of a big Portuguese planter, and the son ends up running all the plantations in Cape Verde, and Abraham has tracked him. So education was not something that couldn't be achieved. It's not for everybody. If you're off in the middle of a cane field, you're not going to get it. But if you're in an urban setting, you can.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Landers, for coming in today, for speaking with us. We truly appreciate you contributing to our ongoing project.
Keep up the work.
Yes, thank you so much, and we are grateful for your presence here today. Also, I just want to say how much of an inspiration you are to many of us here who are doing research, it's particularly in this particular field. Your name is always present in most of the scholarly journals, articles, books, things that we are looking, in regards to resources. So thank you so much for dedicating your life to preserving this history and for archiving it and working so diligently to do so.
Well, thank you, Tika.
You're welcome, ma'am. And did anyone else have anything to say before Dr. Landers, leaves today?
I just want to tell you thank you from one Vanderbilt person to another. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks, Leonard. Thank you
right.
all. Well, I love that you're doing this work, and I'm glad you invited me, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
All right, take care.
I too just wanted to say thank you for being thorough, and that was I'm the one that like to ask those questions that usually end up being a dagger to the misinformation. And I know that you haven't and should not be privy to the what we see on these social media platforms as far as misinformation is concerned when it comes to Black and African history. But for you to answer those questions, those two questions, and give the detail and where you can find it, meaning the Portuguese and Spanish sources and where the sources are in reference to the information is something that's powerful. And I'm gonna make sure that, I know Khalil's gonna do it. He's gonna clip out that part because it is really powerful to hear that for these people that decide to be either lazy or willfully obtuse. You have to find those sources. So thank you so much for saying it, because it needed to be said so we can go. You're an expert, like, we can look your stuff up and people can see it. They don't trust us on TikTok, which they shouldn't. They need to do their own due diligence, go find the information. But the fact that you on live cleared it up, I really appreciate that. And you being as thorough as you are, whatever made you decide to step up front and help us, I appreciate that 100%. I know I can be tough when it comes to our history, and the fact that you are so thorough, I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Dr. Landry, I'd like to say, this is Khalil. I'd just like to say thank you once again, and I appreciate everything that you're doing.
Thank
you. I have pretty much, not all, but most of your books also.
Thank you so much.
I'll be awaiting your next one.
Okay, I'm trying.
All right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, folks, there you have it.